All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. I've always said I wouldn't be a speaker that did that, but it's nice to know that you're alive out there. Uh, Once again, good morning. As the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at the Country School, my name is Keith Smith. I also serve as the school's band director. I want to warmly welcome you to this Witness Stones installation ceremony to honor the life and contributions of Theophilus Niger. Like many of you, this is my first Witness Stones experience, and it has been inspiring to watch our students dig through documents that have been hidden away in dusty archives for centuries so they can attempt to restore the history and honor the humanity of a remarkable man who helped build this community, but whom the community had forgotten. At the country school, we talk a lot about representation, the fact that we all deserve to see ourselves reflected and celebrated in our community. For far too long, Theophilus Niger and others like him were not just not reflected, they were entirely absent from our memory and the stories we know and tell. Today, that is changing. Today, we take one step closer to the tomorrow that has been promised. I have told my students that I am the impossible dream of my enslaved ancestors realized. May we continue to fight until all the forgotten voices of the past have the opportunity to have their stories heard. Barack Obama once said, "Change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the change that we seek." I am continuously inspired by my colleagues and the students that you see in front of you at the country school. It is my honor to introduce our eighth graders who will share what they have learned about Mr. Niger and his legacy. Thank you, students, for doing this work, and thank you, Theophilus Niger, for all you brought to us both then and now.
On behalf of the Country School class of 2022, welcome to this Witness Stones installation ceremony to honor the life and contributions of Theophilus Niger, a man who was enslaved right here for much of his life. During the course of the next hour or so, we will share what we have learned through our archival research, hear from individuals who had a connection to this story and stories like it, and share some of our creative responses to our research. At the beginning of the school year, my classmates, teachers, and I visited this exact spot. Jamoki McDuffie Thurmond, a poet, artist, and educator who joined the country school for this project since our school began doing the Witness Stones project 3 years ago, accompanied us, inviting us to think about the space where Theophilus Niger and his family lived 250 plus years ago. We were asked to look around, listen, ask questions, and try to feel the history that took place and the lives that were lived here. Let's take a moment to do that together. Now, let's move our imaginations to our history classroom. Every day at the start of our class, our teacher, Mr. McDonough, welcomes us with a Zulu greeting. Sawubona, he says, which effectively means, "I see you." The proper response is Ignikona, meaning "I am here." As one of my classmates wrote recently, this is exactly what we have sought to do with our Witness Stones work. We have to try and see Theophilus Niger and show that he is, or was, right here. Our program will begin with Laconia Terrio, a storyteller and chaplain who joined us on campus this year to share stories from around the world. We are grateful for Mr. Therio for reminding us how stories can touch our hearts, minds, and spirits, allowing us to see each other.
Sawubona. Good morning. I was with the young people for a couple of days this year, and I've been wondering which story to tell. They asked me to do the invocation, and I decided I'm going to do the invocation in the form of a story. The title of the story is called The Old, Old Man and the Very Little Boy. The author's name is Christine L. Franklin. Once there was an old, old man whose hair was the color of the clouds. His skin was dark brown like the deep garden soil. His feet were tough and wide because wherever the old man walked, he always walked barefoot. Every morning, the old man would go out and sit on the stump, and he would wait until the sun would rise high in the sky, and when its bones were warmed up enough, then he could move more easily. One morning, the women of the village ran by, on their way to dig in the gardens. Old father, will the rains come?" And the old man, he just closed his eyes, he smiled, and he nodded. The young men with their spears, "Old father, will we find food for the hunt today?" And the old man closed his eyes. He smiled and he nodded. "Full bellies tonight," the young men said. The old man was sitting on the stump. The sun was still high in the sky. He had his eyes closed, and then he heard it. He heard the voice of a very small boy, twittering like a bird. "Old father." But the old man was hard of hearing, so the boy said, "Old father." And then the old man recognized whose voice it was. It was the voice of the little boy who would come to sit with him every day, and he handed the old man a roasted sweet potato. The old man smiled. He took the potato, he dug his hand, he ate, and then he smacked his lips because he only had one tooth. The little boy said, old father, tell me a story." And the old man began beating his chest. "When I was young and proud." And the little boy sat on the ground. And the old man told him stories of bravery, stories of hunts, and stories of the sweetness of love. And then the little boy said, "Old father, were you ever a little boy?" And the old man looked at him and said, "Inside this old man lives a very little boy." "Oh, old father, look at you with your white hair. Look at you with your tough skin. You're the oldest man I know." And the old man laughed with the little boy until he felt the silver tears coming down his wrinkled cheek. The sun was going down over the western horizon. The little boy's mother came by to pick him up. "Old father, I'll see you tomorrow." And the old man said, "No, son. Tomorrow you will be too old to come and play with me." "Oh, old father, I will never be too old." And the boy was off. Well, that boy never visited the old man again. But one day, that little boy grew into a young man, and his father gave him the spear, and he said, "Today you will go with me on the hunt." And as that boy passed the old man, "Old father, I'm going to the hunt. I'm going to the hunt for the first time." And the old man smiled and he nodded. Well, that boy never visited that old man ever again. But one day, not unlike today, the gray clouds gathered. And that old man transitioned from this life to the next. And when that boy, now a young man, heard that his friend had died, he felt some sadness, but life intruded. He found a young woman. He fell in love. They had one child. They had two children. And for him, life was good. And the rains came, and one day, that young boy, his hair began to change toward the color of the clouds. His skin became dark brown like the deep garden soil. And his feet were tough and wide because wherever he walked, he always walked barefoot. And one day, all he wanted to do was sit on a stump, wait for the sun to warm his bones, and then he could walk more easily. One day, some boys and girls came and said, old father, tell us a story." And he began hitting his chest. "When I was young and proud." And they sat on the ground, and he told them stories of the bravery of hunts and the sweetness of love. And then they asked, "Were you ever a little boy?" And he said, "Inside this old man lives a very little boy. Look at you with your wide hair. Look at you with your tough skin. Look at you with your wide feet. You are the oldest man we know. One day, you will get to be as old as I am today," he said. "No, we will never get to be old as you, old father. You are the oldest man ever." And that old man laughed and cried with those kids until he felt the silver tears coming down his wrinkled cheeks. For he was remembering a long time ago when he asked another old man those very same questions. He remembered, he remembered, he remembered. And we remember Theophilus Niger.
Thank you, Mr. Terrio. We will now share what we have learned through our archival research. When we started this project, many of us were frustrated because there were so many holes in the records. Nowhere in the available documents, things like wills, property records, and church records, could we find anything that said where he was born, when he was born, who his parents were, or when or how he came to live in what was then East Guilford and is now Madison. We knew he was enslaved because records describe him as, quote, a servant, or as his enslaver called him, quote, my servant. We have learned that the condition of being a servant was an euphemism for being enslaved in the official records of the time. Toward the end of his life, Theophilus Niger was buying and selling property, leading us to wonder if he might have gained his freedom. Unfortunately, we didn't have anything to prove it. As James, one of our classmates, memorably said, doing the Witness Stones project is a bit like trying to piece together an unpieceable puzzle. Still, using the documents at our disposal, and by doing our own research on AncestryClassroom.com and elsewhere, we began to flesh out the story. Here, representing a compilation of excerpts from the biographies we each wrote and some of our classroom discussions, is what we have learned.
Theophilus Niger was an enslaved man who lived right here near Horace Pond in the mid to late 18th century. Together with his wife Penelope, he built a family and amassed significant holdings, including land, buildings, and farm animals. Towards the end of his life, we believe he lived with his wife and 5 or 6 children. The records are not entirely clear. In a house he owned through the woods. One of our classmates, in fact yours truly, determined the likely location based on the description in a property record. I measured out the rods or the units of measurement used at the time and overlaid those with the map of surrounding properties today. Identified in most early records simply as Theophilus with no last name. At the end of his life, he listed with the surname Niger, and that is the surname his children went on to use after his death. When you think of the first event in anyone's life, you generally think of their birthday. Unfortunately, with many enslaved people, birthdays are unknown, and as we said, West Indies or the New England colonies, all we know for sure is that he was enslaved for much of his life by Thomas and Abigail Hodgkin, who lived in the house across the street, now the home of the first elected woman, Peggy Lyons, and her family.
The first record we have found in which Theophilus Niger is listed by name is for an earmark registration for livestock dated 1739 to 1740. Earmarks were required for livestock so it would be clear who owned which animal. Many of us thought it was interesting that someone who was enslaved had registered an earmark because that meant he must have owned animals. The next time we see him listed by name is in church records, which show his marriage to Penelope Tantipin on April 14, 1748. The minister who officiated was Reverend Jonathan Todd, who later became the enslaver of at least 8 people, including Tamar and Latouche Bailey, the mother and daughter who were researched by previous country school 8th graders, and whose markers are installed in front of the Congregational Church. A few things to consider about the Niger-Tantipin marriage. We have found others living in the area with the last name Tantipin, and they were all identified as Native American. We have also found records for, quote, Penelope Indian, being baptized in a local church a few years prior to the marriage. Baptized that same day was, quote, Nehemiah Indian, and we know there was a Nehemiah Tantipin who fought in King George's War. For those reasons, and several others, we believe Penelope was Native American. We have found no evidence to suggest that she was ever enslaved. At the time, a law existed which held that children would follow the condition of their mother. In other words, if the mother was enslaved, the children would be too. Because Penelope Tantipin appeared to be free, we believe the Niger children were as well, and there are no records to indicate otherwise.
Church records do not say how old Theophilus Niger and Penelope Tantipin were at the time of their marriage, so some of us researched the average age of marriage for a man in the mid-1700s. We discovered that most males are 28 years old at the time of their first marriage. If that average is accurate, then students deduced that Mr. Niger was likely born sometime around 1720. We do not know for certain whether Theophilus Niger was enslaved by Thomas and Abigail Hodgkin at the time of his wedding. We do know that the Hodgkins built this house across the street in 1745, so if Mr. Niger was living with them in the years before his marriage, he would likely have assisted in its construction. Woodworking tools were among the items listed in his inventory after he died, so it wouldn't be surprising to learn that he helped build their home. Church records show that 2 years after their marriage, the Nigers' first child, Philip, was born. He was followed by Phoebe in 1752, Theophilus in 1755, Eliab in 1759, and William in 1760. They may also have had a daughter, Amma, since her name appears in later documents, but we do not have an official birth year for her. Unfortunately, the same year William was born, Penelope Tantipin died, and William died just a couple of weeks later. We wondered whether anything had occurred in 1760 that made the death of a mother and infant likely. One of our classmates discovered that in 1760 there was an outbreak of smallpox in Guilford, brought home by soldiers. We surmised that possibly the deadly disease killed both mother and child.
Throughout all this time, Mr. Niger continued to be enslaved. We have found several documents indicating as much, including the first draft of Thomas Hodgkin's will, written in 1751, in which he promises to leave 2 plots of land to, quote, my Negro man servant Theophilus. The will also promises his freedom after Mrs. Hodgkin dies. 2 years later, however, Thomas Hodgkin rewrote this will, taking one of the plots of land back and giving it to his nephew and neighbor Jedediah Coe instead. Interestingly, after Thomas Hodgkin's death, Jedediah Coe gave Theophilus Niger a plot of land in, quote, consideration of the respect and goodwill I have for Theophilus, a man, Negro, and servant. Around that time, there is also record of Thomas Hodgkin's widow, Abigail Hodgkin, joining Theophilus Niger to sell land to Noah Scranton. We do not know why they would be selling land jointly and or how it connects to the gift from Jedediah Coe. However, the fact that Mr. Niger is owning and selling property as an enslaved person seems both significant and unusual. Abigail Hodgkin prepared her will on February 18, 1760. It made no mention of freeing Mr. Niger. However, for the first time when mentioning property she would be giving him, she did not identify him as a servant. Could that mean he had been freed?
Finally, that question was answered. While searching land records late in our research process, we stumbled upon a record dated 1761, filed in the Town Hall property records under the last name Theophilus, which made it difficult to find. 4 words jumped out at us. They were, quote, Theophilus, a free Negro, unquote. These words appear in a document in which he is purchasing land from Phineas Meigs. Yet again, it is interesting to see that he is buying land. But what is far more important is that it confirms what we had hoped and suspected. By 1761, he was free. Sadly, less than 10 years later, Theophilus Niger was gone. We do not have an exact date for his death, but probate court records show that on July 17, 1770, Jedediah Coe was named administrator of Theophilus Niger's estate. So his death must have occurred sometime before then. It is our estimate about his birth year is correct. He would have been about 50 years old. It is in these probate court documents that, for the first time, we see an actual surname, Niger. Niger is the name of the main river in West Africa, and it is the origin of the name for the countries Niger, and Nigeria. The name Niger derives from the phrase Gur Nigeri, meaning river among rivers, in the Tajmik language. As we have said, after Theophilus Niger's death, his children and his grandchildren continued to use the Niger as the family name.
The inventory of Theophilus Niger's estate gives us some clues as to how he made his living, besides buying and selling property. For instance, along with a house, barn, and significant acreage with multiple uses, fields, orchards, and forests, the inventory includes farm animals, farming and woodworking tools, and fishing equipment. Numerous household items and furniture are listed, along with various items of clothing. A book and fiddle in the inventory may indicate how the family spent any leisure time. The fact that Mr. Niger was able to leave so much to his children must have made a meaningful difference, both for them and for the next generations. After Mr. Niger's death, two of his sons, Philip and Theophilus Niger, served in the Revolutionary War, fighting for our country's freedom. Like their father, the sons, Philip, Theophilus Jr., and Eliab, were apparently involved in the buying and selling of real estate, including a land deal to Daniel Hand.
Meanwhile, Theophilus Jr. sold his property near Horse Pond to Richard Hart from Saybrook in 1784. We discovered that Theophilus Jr. and his wife, Summit, also sold property they owned in Killingworth in 1810. We were not able to learn more about Fove and Emma Niger. This may be because women often took on their husbands' names, making it difficult to find them in archives. After selling their properties in Madison and Killingworth, Theophilus Jr. and Summit moved back to Saybrook, where church records show they lived with several children. Two became barbers and small business owners. There is a record of Alfred and William selling their family property in Saybrook, which, based on its description, would appear to be in North Cove, between Connecticut River and Long Island Sound, land which today would carry a hefty price tag. Some of our classmates walked around Saybrook searching for any history related to the Nigers. They came back empty-handed, although one of the gravestones in the cemetery they visited was for a woman named Rose, who was enslaved by Richard Hart, the man who purchased Theophilus Jr.'s property near Horse Pond.
Theophilus Jr.'s oldest son, Alfred Niger, who would go on to become a prominent black voting rights activist in Rhode Island, helping to lead the only successful antebellum effort in the country to restore the vote to black men, and serving as an agent for William Lloyd Garrison abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. Many articles have been written about Alfred Niger, and he even has a Wikipedia page devoted to his history as an activist from Rhode Island. Alfred Niger and his wife, Julia Ann Brown Niger, had several children, including Alexandra Peshin Niger, whom they named for the first president of the Republic Haiti, quote, signaling undoubtedly the pride he took in his blackness, unquote. As historian C.J. Martin wrote in an article about Alfred Niger and black voting rights, Alexander Pishin Niger, too, recorded some firsts, becoming the first black printer in Providence, becoming a successful business, building a successful business and an estate that included a house near Brown University and property in Nantucket. So far, we have not been able to find living descendants, but with or without stories of contemporary members of the family, we can see the impact Theophilus Niger had. As one student wrote, Theophilus Niger left a legacy for his family, speaking specifically about Alfred Niger. She wrote that she imagines he, quote, took pride in his family and what they have accomplished, and that he probably thought about his grandfather and wanted history to be different for his kids and his grandchildren. He wanted black people to vote and have the same rights as everyone else. There is so much more we could share about Theophilus Niger's story, including what we think we have learned about Penelope and the Tantman family. But we will have to do that another day. We hope that this narrative gives you a sense of the agency with which Theophilus Niger lived his life and how he left his mark, not just on his families and this particular community, but on the larger world.
Although we have learned so much, here are some of the questions that remain. Question number 1. In 2013, the Hodgkin, now Lyons House was visited by an architectural historian who was researching its historical significance. The historian noted some unusual markings on beams in the oldest part of the house, describing them as looking like cardinal directions. When you Google the term cardinal directions, you get something that sounds like the face of a compass. Think of a cross inside a circle. In other houses where enslaved people lived, including Connecticut, symbols have been found carved on surfaces which might appear at first glance to look like the face of a compass. But African art historians have identified those carvings as Ben-Congo cosmograms, or symbols designed to allow someone to connect with their ancestors. The Lyons family kindly allowed me to visit the house to see if I could find a marking.
that looked like a cosmogram. I didn't find it, although there is a crawl space in the attic I wasn't able to examine, but I did find some other carvings on the beams that resembled the backward letter S, or maybe a snake. One West African art expert we spoke with said that snakes also have a symbolic representation in West and Central African belief systems. Wouldn't it be interesting if Mr. Niger left a mark here, perhaps in an attempt to connect with those who came before him and from whom he separated, not just by time, but by an ocean?
Here's another question. In 1739, when Theophilus Niger registered his earmark, there were not many enslaved people in town. In a bit, we will hear from Pat Wilson Phineas, Witness Stone's board chair, whose ancestors were enslaved in Guilford around the same time. May they have known each other? Might they have served as each other's support system? Question 3. What might have it meant for the Niger children to have a Native American mother? How might that heritage have affected their life trajectory? What makes a person who is enslaved considered the property of someone else, able to survive and even thrive?
We don't know the answer to these questions, but we invite you to contemplate them as we listen to the first set of poetry written by our classmates. Here, speaking to that last question, is Sam with his poem, Theophilus' Story. He will be followed by Grace and Claire, who also wrote poetry about the questions they still have.
Do you know why he gave you land, Mr. Niger? Why you, Mr. Niger? He gave you land, Mr. Niger. You were an enslaved person. It wasn't normal to be given land. Though I do not know what you did to receive that land, you, sir, had an impact. To make Mr. Coe, a white man, recognize you, realize that you deserve more, and even though you were not free, he still gave you land. That man valued you back then, even when it was abnormal. For a white landowning man to gift a black enslaved person, at that time, it was unheard of. You did something that changed that man, Mr. Niger. He noticed you. Against everything that seemed typical, you changed him and everything around you. You gave your children the gift of freedom. You set your family free. You were the bird that escaped its cage. You were like the gazelle, free to roam where you pleased. These things you did, Mr. Niger, were not normal. You endured everything wonderful and lousy this country had to offer. Your grandson became a notable black voting rights activist. You caused that. So I sit here today and ask you, sir, how do you feel? Are you happy for your family? Are you mad at all the injustices? Did you feel free?
But was he free? Even if he left, could he forget? As he left his legacy, were the chains pulling him down, metal glinting in the dark against skin, even as he kept his head up? He was born around 1720 and enslaved later, but was he free? He made his own life, married Penelope Tantapin, was the father of 6 kids, but was he free? When they treated him as if he weren't human, was he free? When he was born around 1720, did he know? Did he know he would be enslaved? Was he free? When he was freed, was he really free? Did he wonder what would happen once he died? Did he ever wonder what free even was? Did he wonder if it would go away, or did he think his freedom was forever? When we believe that he was freed, did he believe it too? Did he believe that he was free? But was he free?
My dearest Penelope, by me. Do you ever wonder what humans think about, or why we are hated, or put down, or beaten till we are slow as a turtle? Do you ever think about slavery? Slavery, noun, the state of being a slave, a condition compared to that of a slave in respect of exhausting labor to a restricted freedom. When you fall asleep at night, do you ever wonder who was enslaved? I can answer about 1 of 10.7 million of that question. Theophilus Niger was one of those enslaved people I think about. One that survived the never-ending journey of enslavement across the big black ocean. I wonder what his favorite color was, or what he cared most about in his life, or if he ever said, "My dearest Penelope."
We will now hear from the first select woman, Peggy Lyons, who will share a bit about the house she lives in and why she thinks it's important to share this history. Thank you, Mrs. Lyons, for being so supportive of this effort and welcoming for us here today.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I learned so much today. I just had a few tidbits of the rich history of Theophilus, and I'm so grateful that you spent the time to research somebody who is so important to our community. And this project is great. I've been able to kind of work with you with your first research project, Latouche Bailey, and it's been just fascinating to learn the history of our community like this. So I first learned of Theophilus a few years ago after David and I moved to Madison in 2007, and we bought this special house from his dad, the one that he and his 7 siblings grew up in that house. His dad purchased it in the early 1950s. I had a passion for old houses and was intrigued by its history, wondering what mysteries it held. A few years later, the Madison Historical Society did a binder on the house and then unveiled the will of the original owners, the Hodgkins family. It was here that we learned that an enslaved person was living here when the house was originally built. Just as the deed history was itemized for the land and buildings around us, so too the will itemized other property, including the Negro Theophilus Niger. It was shocking to us to learn that the hands that built our beautiful home, which held so many wonderful memories for the Lyons family, were enslaved hands, the labors of a very dark part of American history. Through the years, our house was the home to many notable Madison families as inhabitants: the Fosters, the Bushnells, Wilcox, families noted in local archives and with plaques adorning many houses in town. However, Theophilus and his legacy was never noted at all. He was one of over 6,000 enslaved people in Connecticut whose stories have been largely ignored or purposely forgotten because they were not considered real whole people at that time. He was forced to labor for food and shelter with his only dream of freedom dependent on the benevolence of his master. A product of his times, he was considered property to be handed off, unimportant and insignificant. Now, today, though, through all the hard work that you guys have done today, we realize that is simply not the case. Thank you for unearthing this rich history of this incredible man and his accomplishments. I'm grateful that my family and I can learn about this unique person who shares a common bond with us, living and thriving in this very beautiful and special place. I'm appreciative that we can celebrate his life and legacy as an integral part of our community and mark it here in the public place for the public to enjoy for generations to come. So thank you so much.
Thank you again, Mrs. Lyons. The next set of poems focuses on what Theophilus managed to accomplish in spite of the enormous obstacles in his way. One of the 5 themes of slavery identified by the Witness Stones Project is agency and resistance. As we have seen, Theophilus Niger showed remarkable agency and ability to resist the conditions he was placed in. Here to speak to that is Miklos, with 2 juxtaposed poems, one about the transatlantic crossing many had to endure, and a second one that expands on the language inscribed on Theophilus Niger's marker. He will be followed by Jack, Harrison, Blake, and James, whose poems speak to the same theme. A candle flickers soundlessly.
throwing light upon the densely packed ship's hold. A banging. Hope fills the hold, comes, then goes, and as long as it takes for a hummingbird's heart to beat. The candle still flickers. Lives are lost, as is the light of the candle, claimed by the ocean or tortured to death, extinguished by a vigorous human exhale, followed by wisps of smoke like rising cirrus clouds. A gentle rocking as the ship docks. It tells the story of false promises, its deep voice murmuring constant words of comfort before the hatch opens. The story of the whip, causing deeper gashes every time. The story of the shouts and pain, and the story of misery and constant injustice. As Epictetus once said, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Theophilus stood up to the system that despised him by getting married, by gaining freedom, by owning land, and by having children, among many other significant accomplishments. He did not anticipate the whip. He did not anticipate the pain, but he was able to find himself amid the suffering, find meaning in it even, and he kept fighting for equity throughout the whole of his life.
The man that deserves everything. A man of many titles, many identifying phrases. As it reads on the witness stone, enslaved here, married to Penelope Tantipin, father, neighbor, provider, farmer, landowner, emancipated circa 1760, died 1770, leaving a legacy. Enslaved here, in Guilford, by Thomas and Abigail Hodgkin, labored in the heat, worked under the sun, sweated through his clothing, bled crimson blood, cried salty tears, longed for emancipation. Married to Penelope Tantipin, by Jonathan Todd, loved her, laughed with her, lived with her, experienced everything with her. Father to Philip, Phoebe, Theophilus Jr., Eliab, Amma, and William. Comforted them, cared for them, praised them for making him proud, treasured them more than the clothes on his back. Neighbor to Jedediah Coe, shared with him, received land from him, helped him. Provider to his family, gifted them to the best of his ability, paid for their life with the little money they had, adored them, always labored for them. Farmer of crops, grew them, prized them, kept them healthy. Landowner of the Wildcat Swamp lot of land from the Hodgkins and land from Jedediah Coe. Maintained the land, resided on the land, managed the land. Emancipated circa 1760, lived his life as a free man. Died in 1770, perished, passed, leaving a legacy worth celebrating, a legacy worth understanding, a legacy that has lived on for centuries, a legacy that is important, a legacy that was just uncovered, like a pocketed pebble that spent years under the soil. The legacy of Theophilus Niger, a man that probably lived only 50 years, a man that left a legacy and is still leaving a legacy, and likely only 5 decades of life, a man that was enslaved, suffered for years on end, a man who is a hero to his family and to me, a man who deserves everything, a man who can't get everything. Recognition, respect, love, honor, equality.
This was life. Born in 1720 into enslavement. Or was it 1723? I guess we'll never know. But what we do know is that like bark from a tree, his rights were stripped away from him just because of the color of his skin. He didn't know why or how, and no one would tell him either. This was life. Just a young boy, forced into the dry and rough fields. Heat rising, energy and years to live, sinking faster than a pebble in the ocean. A million days of non-stop work to be done. And what in return? Nothing. Nothing at all. This was life. A man no different from everyone else, except for the way he was treated. Bought and sold like property, without documentation of his life, except for a very few dates, when he was referred to as a Negro. Besides his neighbor Jedediah Coe, no one seemed to care about him, or even tried to remember him. Life was nothing but a meaningless void, sucking up every last bit of him,
family was forgotten. This was life in the desolate and inhumane times of slavery, where only white males had a voice. Was he taught anything? We can't be sure. But what we do know is that he learned to work endless hours, all day, every day, whether he wanted to or not. Was he given some land, or was he not? Was he given his indebted freedom, or was he not? He already lived a life no one should ever have to live. Yet to come out with a wife and 4 children proves his strength, proves his impact on the world, an impact that was not apparent during his enslavement. This was life. This was life for Theophilus Niger.
Broken freedoms. Theophilus Niger, one of the many. Wildcat Road, where everything happened. Enslaved in Guilford, CT in 1745 by Thomas Hodgkin. Awarded property for being loyal, but not living his life free. No rights, being treated like property, being treated like garbage, being treated like no one cared if he lived tomorrow. Then finding a part of his life that Theophilus hasn't experienced, love. Theophilus married Penelope Tantipin at 20 years old. April 29, 1750 is where he had his first son. Then 5 followed after. Theophilus enslaved for more than half of his life. He deserved to be happy. He didn't deserve to be enslaved. Thank you.
Niger. Theophilus Niger, a man from Guilford, an enslaved man, give one of his animal an earmark, as a free man would do, own livestock on his master's land, as a free man would do, a farmer, an enslaved man who lived in the Hodgkin house, secret markings like spiritual connections. On the beams in the house, he fell in love with the most beautiful woman, Penelope Tantipin, and found a house and called it their own, blessed with 5 children, 4 sons and a daughter. A smallpox pandemic, and Penelope and one of his sons perished. A free man like a bird in flight, make Theophilus a happy man, and now he could stand on his plowed land. 70. At 50, gone way too soon. Remembered always by his children. Thank you. Pat Wilson Phineas, Witness Stone's board chair, has spoken about this notion of legacy and agency, and about how learning the history of her ancestors and their remarkable accomplishments changed her. We thank you, Mrs. Phineas, for joining us at our Witness Stone installation ceremony today to share your wisdom, your perceptive, and some of the parallels you see between your family and the Niger family.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here. Here in Guilford, my soul feels at home, and I know that seems odd and silly because I was born up in Willimantic and live in Ashford, which is about 18 miles from the Mass border. A few short years ago, I felt no connection to Guilford. It was a sort of quaint place that I'd never been. I heard my father say something about maybe having some relatives here at some point, but it went past me and was never researched. In 2018, I was running to be the state representative of my district, District 53, up in Ashford, Tolland, and Wellington. And one day I got a very unexpected call from a gentleman I wasn't expecting to hear from, a middle school teacher who was teaching history. And this was, of course, before there was a Witness Stones project. Dennis Cullinan was pursuing a hobby and working with his 8th grade students to uncover the stories behind the people who had made Guilford. He was excited to be talking to me. I knew nothing about his efforts or about him, but he had been researching the lineage of 2 teenagers who had been enslaved in Guilford in 1727. The Naughty family, oddly named, were a Scottish couple who imported the teens from the Caribbean to Boston. And over about 27 years, these two 17-year-olds came together as a couple and had 8 children, 6 of whom lived, but only 1 grandchild. Dennis found that 1 grandchild, Caesar, searched through his children and their children and their children, and eventually he ran into a descendant who was a Tuskegee Airman. Died in 2002. The obituary was written some 16 years before Dennis found this article. And in that article, it mentioned that the children of this Tuskegee Airman, one of them was the Commissioner of Social Services for Connecticut. And that's how he found me. With a few sharp calls, he found me. This is 16 years later after my father died. He was excited because he had been working for years with dead history and had finally found a living person. So we had a really exciting hour of exchange. I had always been proud of who I was, but the fact of the matter was that before that day, I didn't know exactly who I was. The only connection I had to an ancestral past was my skin color, and in an all-white environment of Ashford, that really stood out. My connection to family beyond my great-grandfather to any distant family past was a single faded photo of a woman who looked like she was in sort of Civil War garb, about 20 years old, but she looked so proud and strong. And from what I knew about the Civil War and slavery and of the age of her clothes, I kept thinking, how could this be? How could she look that secure? My pride and security had come from my father and his uncles, so I didn't really think that I needed much of a history. I knew them. I knew the accomplishments that they had made. They were world-traveled musicians and artists, and they had done some incredible things. Like so many black children who have no knowledge of their history, I learned to think that perhaps I didn't need it. I assume that what I've been taught in school was true and that life for black men in this country began with the Emancipation Proclamation. When I looked at that old picture, I wondered, how did she look so proud and strong? And how had my relatives come so far in such a short time? I wondered, but no matter, what did I really need with that past? Like so many black children, I didn't know my past. No one talked about slavery. I need a Kleenex, sorry. No one talked about slavery or about being chattel. I was taught to focus on the future. I was taught to look at the past only as a vehicle for forward movement. I was raised by a Tuskegee Airman, and the creed that I was raised with said, aim high, use your brain, be ready to go, never quit, expect to win, and rise above. That's who raised me, and that was the history, all the history I thought I needed. That and the story of the tortoise and the hare. But one day, I met Dennis Culloden, and until that day, these questions lingered. You can't miss something you never knew you had. And I could not have understood just how important the answers to my unanswered questions would be. The fact is, I hadn't seen anything of myself that was meaningful that happened before the Civil War in any history I'd ever been taught. There was only slavery for my historical context. I thought 1863 was somehow a defining date. I hated studying history because the only place I came up in it was in the Civil War, where I was depicted as either a pitiful slave in the sun or someone eating watermelon, happily smiling about their condition. When we studied slavery, I was the visual representation of a slave. Not much to feel good about. When Dennis's work restored my real history, I learned for the first time about things my forebears did, and they had a profound effect on me. I think that day I found the missing piece of my soul. I learned that yes, my ancestors had been enslaved here in Connecticut, but during those years of enslavement, family members had become a slave king and a factotum, fought as a freedman in the Revolutionary War, been fiddlers and spinners, been memorialized in biographies and memoirs, been literate, some of them, owned and passed property on to their families, become ministers, one of whom mounted a movement to find homes in Africa for former slaves. And all of this was before the Civil War began. And I learned that that old picture of Miss Dealey, which is the only thing we ever called her in the old picture, was actually my second great-grandmother, Ardelia Burks. And the reason she had such a strong resemblance to my niece was because it was her great-grandmother. Who knew? What was the meaning of this new knowledge to me at my age? Because I was nearly 70 when, when Dennis discovered this stuff. So, you ever hear Mika Brzezinski talking about know your value? Sometimes on television you'll hear her talking about women trying to get equal rights with men and how important it is to know your value. Well, knowing my history gave me a new measure of my value. The gift of my history changed me. Knowing my history expanded my horizon, and it increased my commitment to this country. It anchored me. Of course, some facts made me mad and some of it made me sad, but ultimately I was reoriented and invigorated by the knowledge. The new knowledge changed the way I looked at myself and what I saw as my purpose. It made me appreciate my place in the history of this country. I am the 9th of 11 generations of American family. Knowing this gives me a sense of belonging, ownership, and entitlement, not just to a family legacy, but to this very nation. This knowledge made me love America more because I realized how deeply I and my family had already invested. How dare someone suggest that this land is not mine? My experience in school hadn't given me in that investment. Everything I'd ever been taught was that somehow America was mine by default, that we got here, worked here, got let go, and we were kind of here. Why else would people say, go back to where you came from, or why don't you go back to where you came from? Why else would I see nothing of myself taught to me in my history class? Why would kids tease me about being the representation of a slave? With new knowledge, I know that America is mine because 300 years of my ancestors' sweat and tears earned her for me. My people didn't inherit America or get their rights as squatters or through land grants freely given to others. They earned their place in our history and in this land with their blood, and they shaped and fought for America's existence and freedom at a time when their own was denied. The patriotism of my father, a Tuskegee Airman, demonstrated by fighting in 3 wars, because he fought also in Korea and Vietnam. Black men have done that and not been thanked for it for years. This is not new. Having to fight in order to fight for this country? No new theme. Why is this? Think on that for a minute. Factual historical information made me grateful. It made me grateful that I was born at a time when I could control my own destiny and that I am strong enough to cherish the lessons of a time when I could not. I'm grateful that I live in a country with the honor and the endurance to want to grow. Learning my history made me proud of all my forebears had done and built. It made me curious about what else I didn't know, and it made me want to uncover and discover far more. It made me want to grow what I knew and to learn more about other people, because I realized that the deficits that were in my life are in a lot of other people's lives. There are a lot of people that don't know past their great-grandfathers. And it's important for all of us. Think about it. I want the children to think about, what if they had never had this exposure? What if they had never thought about the things that they've clearly thought about and internalized? What does the fact that they have thought about it mean for our future? Now, as for the pieces of the things that are relevant about my family to Theophilus Niger, there are many similarities. One of those was the way you've got to dig for facts and put pieces together to make them somehow work out. There are so many frustrations in filling the holes of history, having to learn to read against the grain, to take documents and put thoughts and feelings behind them and imagine what must have happened and then make a story. Then there are the euphemisms in language like servantry versus slavery. There are the name changes, Theophilus, Theophilus Negro, Theophilus Niger, in my case, Montrose, Montramp. I mean, the names weren't important to the people who were writing them down. The value was important and the ownership was important, not the names and history of the slaves. So they were all over the place and therefore hard to find. The general powerlessness of women in these times is something that resonates with me, but not just because in the children's research, young people's research, I guess, just, the older I get, the more I stumble over that. In their research, they found that the lady, Miss Tenope, I'm not pronouncing her name right, but Theophilus's wife, that her children, her girl children, couldn't be traced. What happens to them? They change their names, but at any rate, and also in my case, the powerlessness of the slave owner's wife, Mrs. Naughty, and how she had to conduct all of her business through her nephew. So that was a theme that resonates for me. And also things like the continuing impact of history, the way the Theophilus family thrived as long as they did, and they may still be here amongst us. It was things that made that happen, their ability to hold land, their ability to use the legal system, their ability to pass that land on, their ability for education. All of these things make a difference. And still, there were the unanswered questions that maybe I could take a stab at answering. Did Theophilus feel free? Was he secure in his freedom? Probably not. None of us can be free until all of us are free. And I suggest that we aren't. The very existence of a Black Lives Matter movement, of Jim Crow voter suppression tactics, of the potential impact of the loss of bodily integrity with a Roe reversal, all of these things are things that suggest that we are not yet all free. And for those of us who thought we were, I suspect we may need to think again. Looking backwards may be useful to recognize ground that you have traveled before. Direct parallels between my family's experience and that of the Nigers: agency through service and loyalty. The reason he was given that land was because he was such a good man in taking care of the family. And that was a way to survive. Some people call it Uncle Tomism or something else. But in those days, it was a viable way of making your family live and thrive and be viable, and they did that. The stability of his family, because his children were born free, was important. Again, when he married the native woman, his children were free. The inheritance. Just like Theophilus, my family also was given a land inheritance and money and things of that nature after Mrs. Naughty died, and in my case, that was 30 years. So they stayed in this limbo state for nearly 30 years, but eventually did receive that money and that property. And that is things that were passed down through my family and allowed me, perhaps, to be where I am today. So that legacy of land and property was terribly important. And the fact that after enslavement, even after Theophilus died, his children went on and built and left a legacy of their own, and that too follows with me. As descendants, we moved forward, each generation building on what they could from the last. Then there are the potential connections. You noted that the person that married Theophilus was the reverend whom one of my relatives ended up with. I won't go through the whole story, but basically, the Reverend Todd Caesar, who would have been my fifth great grandfather, ended up with him after his mother died, and he was passed probably to a family that had young black children there. So he may have been at the wedding for all I know. Students in this class went beyond the assignments to find their own answers. And in doing so, you found one for me. One of my uncles, fifth grade uncles, died in about 1760. That would have been Abel. And now I think it was because of smallpox that you guys discovered that there was a smallpox epidemic that year. So that's important. Every time this organization lays a stone, every time these students lay a stone, they are making a place. You talk about place-based education, this is it. Because of your in-depth work, you mentioned making connections to your town in ways that you hadn't before. And I think that that's a critical part of your learning. So I want to thank you for your work, for your questions, your industry, your patience, your compassion, and your creativity. I thank you for your generosity of your spirit, and I thank you for your growth. I think that Montrose and Theophilus would not only be grateful, they would be proud of you. I am. You gave Theophilus dignity, you honored his history and restored his humanity. You recognized his accomplishments. You made him live again through the accomplishments of his children that you connected to him. You gave him a voice. And I suspect that that voice, with all of its promise and pain, will live in your memory as it will in mine. As one single representative of a million unknown descendants, I want you to know that your work has been a blessing to me. Thank you.
Thank you again, Mrs. Phineas. Yes. Mrs. Phineas. Our final set of poems speak to the power of the story. Thinking back to what Mr. Thoreau said at the outset about how stories can build, bridge, and connection. Caroline, Milo, Anna, and Evelyn will show how they have attempted to build a narrative where there was none, constructed a bridge across time, and highlighted our connections.
A square of language. You take a walk, not noticing what is beside your feet. Words etched into a golden block, glowing in the summer's heat. Take a look at that stone. We acknowledge the life of an enslaved person. Reflect on the life of a man. Appreciate the life of a father, husband. The story of Theophilus. Trapped like a firefly in a jar, glowing, leaving behind a legacy of resistance. Leaving behind a story to remember.
Lost to time. Time is powerful. It steals life, memory, love, but mostly it steals stories. Countless stories are lost to time, never told again, until now. Theophilus Niger, a man, his date of birth not even known, lost to time. Theophilus Niger, a father, his children went on to live, not just exist. Theophilus Niger, a farmer, went on to own animals, land, after being enslaved. These stories have been lost to time, until now. Thank you.
Uncovered legacy. In Madison's backyard is a tree, a hickory tree. Strong, powerful, beautiful. All around were flowers, flowers of all colors, colors of the rainbow. Till they are strong enough, the trees will protect the flowers. In the flowers, 5 seeds appear, 5 seeds of the tree. Those seeds will grow, multiply, taking the nutrients of the tree, surviving because of the tree. Thriving, growing, spreading, filling a space in the world. One day, gone, disappeared. Only thing left, roots of the tree, hidden under pounds of dirt. Almost 2 centuries later, 31 students find those roots, dig up a new seed, planting that seed, a legacy.
Sawubona Ingikona, I see you, I am here. Theophilus Niger, Toffee. We attempt to pull his voice from the narrow-minded titles he's constrained within. Slave, Negro, servant, mine, ugly words dance on the paper lips of history. We are hungry too. We hunt for details with fervor and desperation. We chase the words in a helpless need to know. The more known, the more pulled, threads connecting in a tangled, mangled mess. Theophilus could be the name of a daffodil. Flowers don't get to choose their names, but they still inspire hope. I need to know, but not as much as they needed. I wish to take them in my arms, those I painstakingly unearthed, one by one. Penelope, quietly strong, a mother of 6. Penelope. Philip, firstborn son of the resilient, left with the responsibility of being the eldest. Philip. Phoebe, daughter of the strong, growing up female, black, and indigenous in a time where no respect would be afforded her. Phoebe. Theophilus, second son of a survivor, determined to live up to his name. Theophilus Jr. Eliab, third son, born of perseverance. Eliab. William, innocent, taken from life before he could learn the harsh realities of racism. William. Amma, daughter of those who fought to thrive in a world that refused to acknowledge their humanity. Emma. Alfred, Henry, Theophilus III, Alfred and William, grandsons of hope, bravery, optimism. Alexander Peshin Niger, Elizabeth Kennedy Niger, Mariah C. Niger, Frederick Augustus Niger, Margaret F. Niger, great-grandchildren of the proud, bold, self-reliant, inspirational, and resourceful. Still more, a legacy of rippled water in Theophilus's wake, branching off into new tributaries in tribute to this man of long ago, twisting and turning, cutting a path through history in ways unexpected. Harriet Francis, Roland Francis, Elizabeth A., Frank T., Walter, Nancy, all Nigers in a tree forcibly replanted, all branches growing from roots unknown. So all we begin at is Theophilus Niger.
Rather than writing poetry, some of us opted to create visual art for our final projects. Our artwork is displayed along with artist statements on the tables over there. If you haven't already done so, please stop by and check out our work after the ceremony ends. You will find the drawings and graphic design inspired by our research and even a photo essay exploring some of the trees, landscape, and buildings of the Niger family may have encountered. You can find more about our work, including some poetry you didn't hear today, on our school Witness Tones website, which you can find find a link in our program. In addition, we will be compiling our work into a book similar to the ones previous country school classes produced about Lettuce Bailey and her mother Tamar. If you would like a hard copy of the Theophilus book, please let us know.
For our last student artist presentation, here's Christopher, who opted to compose a musical response to our Witness Stones work. Christopher will describe his thought process here, and then we will hope technology will allow us to hear a tribute to Theophilus Niger.
My piece is introduced with a simplistic melody played by the clarinet. I've nicknamed this first section Africa with a question mark because we don't really know much about how Theophilus started his life and if he was even born in Africa or America. I like to think that he had a nice, happy childhood before he was brought into slavery. This section then breaks into sort of a fanfare-like phrase with the trumpet and violin that I think has sort of a happy but also a little bit mysterious feel, like the beginning of what we know about Theophilus's life. The second section starts with a transition. Starts its transition with a 3-note progression with a sort of clashing note underneath that has a quick minor note that introduces a new sort of mysterious feel that is very sort of sad and slow, which is supposed to represent the sort of sad and very hard part of his life, the part where he was enslaved. And there's also a trumpet part that plays repeated triplets, that acts as a bit of a heartbeat, that sort of symbolizes the few small good things that happened during his enslavement, the promise of freedom and land, as well as his marriage and the birth of his children. So this last section is my favorite. It starts with a low note and is arpeggiated into a higher note and starts a repeated phrase. This phrase is intended to make the listener feel very hopeful. It has a large contrast in comparison to the previous sad section. This section represents the accomplishments of Theophilus, his selling of land to Noah Scranton, owning cattle, as well as our work with the Witness Stones Project. This last section represents something rewarding that we've done to highlight the life of a forgotten man. So let me see if we can...
Christopher. Before moving on to our closing speaker, we would like to call your attention to the contributors section of your programs. So many people have contributed to our project this year and to this event today. Please refer to your programs for a list of those who we are indebted to. We do want to specifically mention two people who not only made today possible, but who made this overall project possible. Our first special shout out is to Elke Zygmunt, Country School Class of 2019, who did a lot of initial research and transcriptions for this year's project. And of course, we must give a special thank you to Dennis Colton, founder and executive director of Witness Stones. Thank you, Mr. Colton, for bringing the Witness Stones project to the world, changing what we know of our history and giving us an opportunity to help restore it. As one of my classmates said recently, doing this project changed me. I see new stories and connections everywhere.
Introduce our final speaker, Mr. Jamoke McDuffie Thurmond. As already mentioned, Mr. Jamoke was with us this past fall when we first visited this space to try to feel Theophilus Niger. This spring, after we had concluded our research, he joined us again. This time we met in the classroom, where he led us through an exploration of poetry, first examining work by poets such as Lucille Clifton and Langston Hughes, and then reading from his own poetry collection, Recipe for Resurrection, which grew from his archival research into his enslaved ancestors. Mr. Jamoki showed us how poetry can speak and what can't be spoken, and how it can build bridges across time. Thank you, Mr. Jamoki, for sharing your talents and wisdom with us so that we could not just restore the history, but honor the humanity and truly feel the presence of Theophilus Niger.
Good morning. I'm clearly not Mr. Jamoke. Unfortunately, he was unable to join us here today, but I am honored to share some words that he prepared. My name is Honor Clements, and I am a 2012 graduate of the country school. This year, I've been teaching, coaching, and advising on campus. And as someone who has always loved history and who will be teaching it at a boarding school next year, it is incredibly inspiring to hear what this group of 8th graders, some of whom are my students and some of whom are my advisees, to hear what they have done this year. How often does a group of middle school students actually get to do the work of a historian? How often is the work an 8th grader does in history class capable of changing or correcting the historical record? And how often do we connect history and poetry, allowing us to truly see and to feel the subjects we are researching? I am truly blown away by the work that you have all done. One of the things Mr. Jamoke started when he researched his enslaved ancestors and wrote Recipe for Resurrection, his collection of poetry, is that he is also descended from European blood relatives who lived in Wallingford and later Middletown, Connecticut. My family and I are descended from that same Connecticut family. When my mom, Liz Lightfoot, who worked on this Witness Stones project with these students and their teachers, Kristen Liu and Will McDonough, learned about this connection, she knew she had to tell Mr. Jamoke. They met before his first visit to campus, and she told him what she had discovered. As she tells it, he paused, then smiled broadly and said, quote, "This is perfect. This is why we need to do this work, to reckon with our history and find out how we are all connected. This is how we heal." So here are Mr. Jamoke's words. Language is an immeasurably powerful tool. At its best, it can gift us the ability to reconstruct realities from fragments, to question and ponder and create in ways that alter our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. I believe that all of us have a profound responsibility to use language wisely and with care. The work that these students have shared with you today is a beautiful expression of such care. It is a testament to the impact that approaching history with attentiveness and the courage to face the truth can have. The legacy of Theophilus Niger is a poignant reminder that the past is not static. It is always enveloped in the present, always offering itself to us if we are open enough to speak back to it. May we all learn from these powerful examples displayed by these students today and find ways in our own lives to speak back and support the telling of narratives and histories that refuse to be erased or forgotten. Thank you. I also want to say one thing that isn't scripted. I just want to give a huge shout out and thank you to my mom, Liz Lightfoot, who worked so hard all year to put this together, and today especially. And I should say it's not scripted because she wrote the script.
No, but I also just want to thank Will McDonough and Kristen Liu, and I didn't want to say anything. I was going to keep my mouth shut today, and obviously Mr. Culleton. Thank you so much. Everyone here, students, you've done an amazing job. Please come up and see Theophilus Niger's marker here and come visit him often. And the artwork there, which we had to put on its back because it kept blowing over, but please read the student statements too. Thank you all.
Lovely.